Hey everybody, welcome back. It's been about 3 days since Hurricane Irma passed over Miami, and I wanted to take this opportunity to show you how hurricanes have shaped and changed the South Florida landscapes and ecosystems for millennia. And I'm going to be doing that by going on about a 9-mile run through Crandon Park in Key Biscayne. We're going to be seeing for sure downed trees, defoliation, and flooding. So really looking forward to seeing what the hurricane's been up to and showing you as well. So let's take a look at the gear I'm going to be using. Starting off, we've got a pair of Nike-free fly knits. There's been a debate raging in the running community for about a decade and a half about whether support or a more minimalist approach is best for running, and I fall squarely in the latter camp. So I use these shoes from everything from marathons, road races, to some pretty gnarly trail running, and I find that if you just tie them tight enough, they give you a really good feel for the terrain and really good grip. Though if you have any sort of knee or back or ankle problems, I definitely do not suggest that you go the minimalist route. I've also got a pair of running shorts. Very important when running in hot weather is a hydration belt with 2 bottles, and then finally a GPS running watch. So let's get going. So I'm running along the beach northward on Key Biscayne. And the very first thing you'll notice, of course, is all this turtle and manatee grass up on the shore. That was a product of the wave action and the storm surge, ripping that out of the sea bottom and depositing it here along the shoreline. Also, even though it's been 3 days, the water is still very cloudy. That's all the fine particles suspended in the water. That does a good amount of damage to coral and to marine plants. Now I want to bring you over to the dunes. This water washed right over these dunes. This is the highest elevation in Key Biscayne, by the way. But I'm running currently on what used to be sand dunes. And the surge carved right into it and went right over it. You can see that by all the seagrass that's deposited on the top. And that's bad news. I'm also seeing a whole lot of coral and sponges deposited along the shoreline right there. And that indicates really strong storm surge, just pulling it right off of the ocean bottom and dragging it over here. But going back quickly to the dunes, that's bad news for Key Biscayne and all the other coastal communities that were hit by this hurricane, because they're the very first line of defense between the ocean and the buildings right on the other side. This might look like a whole lot of rocks deposited on the shoreline, but it's not. What you've got here are different kinds of sponges: encrusting sponges, fell sponges, saw a stinker sponge, and also a whole lot of sea urchins. So there's good news and bad news. The good news, there's a bell sponge. The good news is that over the last couple of decades, a lot of the habitat that was taken up by corals, hard and soft corals, was kind of purged, and the sponges moved in and took over that really valuable real estate. And since we haven't had a really big hurricane down in South Florida since Hurricane Andrew, these sponges have grown enormous and just kind of crowded out the corals. So when you got a big hurricane that sweeps through, what it'll do is it'll knock down those big bell sponges and encrusting sponges and all manner of different types and deposited here on the shoreline, which allows, hopefully, the corals to regain some of their lost territory. The bad news is that, as I said earlier, along with the sponges, we've got quite a few sea urchins that were thrown up on the shore. Ooh, some hairy stuff here. And those guys are like the lawnmowers of the ocean. They'll just go through seaweed like it's nothing, all sorts of algae, and that allows coral to take root in rocky outcroppings rather than have it taken over by algae. So this hurricane definitely put a big number on the sea urchin population, and I'm hoping they'll recover soon. Seawater cut right through here, forming this channel around the dunes. Pooled here for a little bit, forming these undulations, and I went right into Crandon Park this way. Some of the palm trees are knocked over, a little defoliated, but by and large they're okay. And that's because they've evolved to deal with regular hurricanes. And first of all, palms and coconuts aren't actually trees. They're grasses because they don't have any bark. But they've developed this conical shape to allow the hurricane winds to pass right through them. They can bend, so they have these palm fronds rather than leaves. They kind of bend with the wind, and allows them to move with the gusts rather with the more brittle trees like oaks or black olives, which I've seen all over Miami, which I've cracked, like over here, or have just been knocked over because they were imported and they didn't evolve to deal with these cyclical storms. Some of the low-lying areas are still flooded, but by and large, 3 days after the hurricane, the vast majority of the water has receded. And the reason for that is that the very distinct topography found in Florida. So the way the landscape is defined, you've got a thin layer of topsoil, and beneath that you've got sandy soil, and beneath that you've got a limestone bedrock. So that sand allows the water to drain very easily from the surface into the aquifer. The bedrock itself is very porous, so it allows the water to pass right through. And that's opposed to, say, Hurricane Harvey that hit Houston, and 1-2 weeks after the hurricane passed, there was still serious flooding. That's because Houston is located on red clay, which is not porous. It holds the water at the surface. So though we get hit by more storm surges, more hurricanes, we have more frequent flooding. At the very least, when it does flood, it drains pretty quickly. We're now running through habitat known as tropical savanna, and I don't need to tell you that hurricane force winds can do some serious damage to this environment. Defoliates the canopy of the trees, knocks trees down, or tears off their branches. But it can also, because there's more sunlight reaching the bottom of the floor, it also allows the younger trees, the saplings, to grow and expand the habitat. Much more so than the winds, what I'm more worried about here is the salination. So you can tell by the color of the grass and just the marks on the sidewalk and how the leaves have congregated that seawater definitely reached as far back. So what I'm worried about is that salt water, once it recedes, it leaves the salt in the soil, making it much harder for plants to grow. There's quicksand right there if I've ever seen it. We're now running through a very different kind of habitat. This is a mangrove swamp, and it reacts very differently to hurricanes than, say, a tropical savanna. So you will get defoliation of a lot of the trees, but because red mangroves have very strong root systems that kind of buttress the trunk, like, well, flying buttresses in Gothic cathedrals, they don't tend to be uprooted. Hurricanes, like in much else, have deleterious and positive benefits for mangrove swamps. So as the water comes in, deposits a layer of silt, fine particles, onto the ground of mangrove swamps, and this can kill off some of the seedlings, some of the saplings of the mangroves. And like I said, you also have defoliation, which weakens the tree significantly. But once the waters recede, the seedlings have a greater chance of growing to maturity because they have more sunlight. Moreover, you've got the actual seeds of the mangroves, which are shaken loose in summer, exactly during hurricane season. They're shaken loose by the wind, dropped into the water, and then transported to other locations where they can grow. So, as in much else, the hurricane is both a positive and a negative. Over here you can see Bear Cut, which separates Key Biscayne from Virginia Key. And that channel was created several hundred years ago by another major hurricane. So these hurricanes have had serious, long-lasting effects on the landscape, the terrain of South Florida. Even further beyond that, past Virginia Key, you have Norris Cut, which just about 150 years ago was also formed by a hurricane. So these three islands, and even further away, Miami Beach, were all part of one barrier island, but they were separated by these huge hurricanes. Man, I can barely tell what the path is here. By barely, I mean not at all. One of the greatest dangers you'll face when running right after a hurricane comes from downed power lines. You never know which ones are live or not, so my advice is to stay as far away from them as you possibly can, especially if there's still water somewhere around, because through the conductive principles of H2O, you can get electrocuted and be 100 feet away from a live wire, but you just so happen to touch that water that it's laying in, you could die. Luckily, here in Crandon, there aren't really very many electrical lines being run through. Medium and long-term danger after hurricane comes from those aforementioned pools of standing fresh water. They become breeding grounds for mosquitoes, which rapidly multiply, and they act as very good vectors for a bunch of diseases, from dengue fever to malaria to Zika. And I can already feel myself being attacked by them, and I know the second that I stop running, they're just gonna swarm all over me. It might already be a little too dark to see this, but over to my right is an area known as Crandon Gardens. It used to be the old Crandon Zoo. There are all sorts of different animals in there. Monkeys, bear, even alligators. But after Hurricane Andrew struck in 1992, then the whole complex was destroyed, and it was converted It's a kind of a manicured preserve where you've got all sorts of migratory birds like Canada geese, ducks, herons, egrets. There's a ton of peafowl in there. Just a whole lot of birds hanging out, nesting, breeding. You can still see the cages in there. Fortunately, it's closed due to Irma, so I can't show you myself. But if you go in there, you'll see these, what by today's standards are terrible conditions that the animals are kept in these tiny cages with no natural landscaping. So I'm actually kind of glad they shut it down. I'm back in the village of Key Biscayne. Much of the power has been restored, though by no means all. Some of the street lamps are back up. Some of the restaurants are up and running. But my understanding is that at this moment, about a third of Miami-Dade still doesn't have power. So we still have a very long way to go before we're back to normal. All right, everybody. The sun is set, so I'm not even sure if you can see me right now. But that marks the end of my 9-mile run. All in all, the destruction was bad, but not nearly as bad as it could have been. If these habitats survived Hurricane Andrew, they can definitely survive Irma. The streets were more or less open, though the sidewalks definitely were not. I wound up running on the street quite a bit, which I hate. But again, I think we can definitely make it back from this. And looking forward to seeing you guys again next time. Bye.